thank you very much for joining us at the last of the trade show days. Really appreciate your time, and thank you to the outstanding organisers of this amazing Avalon International Air Show. It's my pleasure to be here today. My name is Lisa Brown, and together with Steve Bray, we're going to be presenting on building resilient supply chains for defence. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians on the land on which we meet today, the Wadawurrung people. We also pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We're representing Accenture today, a professional global services company with leading capabilities in digital, cloud and security. Our 730,000 strong team globally delivers strategy and consulting, technology, operations and specialist services through Accenture Song. We're across 40 industries and more than 120 countries. Today, we're pleased to share some pivotal research co-authored between Accenture Australia and the Melbourne Business School. And in breaking very exciting news, we'll also be introducing some brand new research conducted by our global research team. This research saw 21 in-depth interviews conducted with defence and defence industry executives from Australia, Canada, Finland, Singapore, Sweden, the UK and the US, so quite extensive research with a number of SMEs at the very senior levels. This research will be officially launched next month, and it explores the linkages between military readiness and supply chain resilience, the barriers to adoption, the benefits and the uses of digital twin technologies in the Australian supply chain context, in fact in the global supply chain context. The format of our presentation today is broken into three main parts. The first, exploring what supply chain resilience is and what this means in a defence context and some of the features of a resilient supply chain. The middle component explores our global research and the soon-to-be launched global paper, Military Readiness Through Supply Chain Resilience, Transforming Defence Supply Chains with Digital Twins. The final component will be demonstrating a digital twin in the supply chain context. It'll provide some working examples of the benefits of supply chain supplier mapping and a couple of different use cases. We'll then welcome some questions. We've got a great intimate audience today, so I'd love to get you involved, and then we can have an open forum at the end, time permitting. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Steve to talk more about how we at Accenture view defence supply chain resilience. Thanks, Steve.
Good morning, everybody. Wow, hasn't the last 3 years shown us the importance of the performance of our supply chains? So what do we mean by supply chain resilience? We talk about it in the sense of it's an organisation's ability to absorb, adapt and recover from a disruptive event. So if we take a car example, has anyone tried to buy a new car recently? It's a 10-month wait if you want to buy just the most basic car, right? So if you think about that in terms of the supply chain of the automotive industry, so in that car example, where the key components of that car, things like the electronics that go into the engine management units, it's the ability of a supply chain to absorb, adapt, and in that case, recover from a supply chain disruption. Now, it's not like supply chain practitioners haven't had to manage risk in the past. We've always had to think about these risks, and we've had to do it across the full spectrum of planning horizons, whether it be operational in the sense of supplier variance, supply performance, whether it be tactical, we think about demand and supply planning, or whether it be at the strategic level, where we're worried about flexibility, redundancy across the end-to-end network. And it's where more sophisticated organisations will be using tools like digital twins across the end-to-end to assist. So whilst demand and supply risks have always been present, it's the magnitude, the frequency and the duration of the disruption that's changing. And it's these changes that are causing leading organisations to extend their supply chain risk management capabilities to provide for the ability to stress test their supply chains, to identify potential vulnerabilities, and to understand the supply chain's ability to absorb and respond from a disruption. So let's have a look at where some of that supply chain disruption is coming from. I won't talk to all of these, but if we take a few, so we think about geopolitical, perhaps one of the most obvious at this point in time, where we've seen the impact of the war in Ukraine on supply disruption. So if we look at gas, for example, we know the instability of Russian supplied gas, and by the way, Russia supplies 45% of the EU's entire gas imports, and in that case, the gas price rose tenfold due to that supply disruption. If we think about food and food supplies, so the disruption of the export of Ukraine grain, where Russian ships and sea mines block the Ukrainian Black Sea ports, and with rail only able to accommodate 20% of the typical export volume. If you think about workforce and workforce stability and the impacts of the Chinese government imposing severe lockdowns on their people, cutting off the supply of labour, significantly diluting manufacturing capacity, but also significantly reducing the capacity through some of the world's largest ports. And more closer to home, extreme weather, where Australia has been significantly impacted. And if we look recently at the massive flooding in the north, where we've seen road infrastructure has been washed away, and with estimates of months before road supply chains can be reconnected. So the last few years of disruptive events has served to highlight that our supply chains have indeed been operating with a range of vulnerabilities. They're laying dormant in the way we design, plan, fund, operate our supply chains. Okay, so if recent events have reminded us that supply chain disruptions are inevitable, how should we start to think about managing that supply chain risk? Well, we start to better manage the risk when we better understand and appreciate the cross-functional nature of supply chains, and that opportunities to build increased resilience exists across the entire value chain. So that means we need to understand our suppliers, our manufacturers, our logistics, our demand and consumption, and our labour. And the sorts of things people are looking at when they're considering this end-to-end is, how do we better manage our supply network? How do we better understand and manage the risk in our manufacturers? And how do we better manage our logistics providers, multiple carriers, multiple nodes, etc.? And how do we better understand the planning across those to bring them all together in a coordinated fashion? So hopefully what this view starts to signal is just how important visibility across the end-to-end supply chain is to managing supply chain resilience. All right, going to take a bit of a different tack and look at the impact of some of COVID-19 disruption on the supply chain. Just look at some data. So Lisa reminds me that this is a very busy slide, so I'll try to navigate you through it. It's a slide that tries to talk to the physical logistics components of the disruption, and the top half of the slide brings your attention to what happened to air freight, and the bottom half of the slide brings your attention to what happened to ocean freight. So if I draw your attention to the top half, where we talk about air freight, you can see that during COVID, the price of air freight went up 500%. And over to the right, it's a chart that looks at the capacity of air freight that was available versus demand. And without going too much into it, it's ostensibly saying that, yes, the demand for air freight dropped during COVID, but the capacity dropped even greater. So for the entire period of COVID, the demand for air freight significantly outstripped the available capacity. We all remember just how many aircraft were flying during COVID. Many of us still have holidays that we haven't been able to rebook. It's another topic. Ocean freight. If we just talk about ocean freight for a minute. So ocean freight lead times increased 30%. And look at what happened to ocean freight pricing. So the price of a 40-foot container went from $1,300 USD to over $10,000 USD. So what we draw from this is, with supply chain disruption, we see reduced degraded responsiveness and lengthening supply chains. And we see freight costs increase significantly, driving supply chain costs to unprecedented levels. Anyone undertaking a house renovation? to which extent that material relies on imports? Well, hopefully this chart gives you a sense for where some of those price increases are coming from and some of the delays your builders might be communicating to you. Okay, so let's bring this a little closer to defence. So I'm sure all of us here have a strong appreciation for the defence portfolio objectives. So I'm not going to spend too much time there. But what we did want to talk about is, despite being a fundamental input to capability, it often appears that supply chain's importance to these objectives is not fully appreciated. If we look at preparedness, and we consider that through the lens of material preparedness, then we think of the 800,000 stock codes made up of consumables and expendables and repairables, all needing to be considered in terms of how they're going to meet the readiness and sustainability objectives of preparedness. If we pause to think about readiness, readiness is the material we've assessed and pre-positioned in our warehouses now, or at least within a short lead time in the notice to move period. Sustainability, however, more challenging, as this refers to the capability of our supply chains to maintain throughout the mission or the OVP period and beyond. So recognising that military supply chains are often exposed in a contested environment, it is our supply chain's ability to absorb, adapt and recover from disruption that can deliver a force multiplier. So I also want to just remind us all just how complex our military supply chains are. They're multi-layered, multi-tiered, highly diversified and global. All this adds to increased vulnerabilities across our military supply chains. And just before we leave this slide, it's important to recognise just how much of the resources and capacity that a military supply chain uses that is shared with commercial supply chains. We share freight modes, we share ports, we share labour. So they're not separate in the way we might think about them. So let's look at some information we worked on that illuminates what happened to the ADF's supply chain during COVID. Now, clearly for security classification reasons, there's not much detail we can go into here other than illuminate some trends that we observed. And essentially 3 things played out, and I'd expect that none of you would find this surprising, but lead times increased, prices increased, and interestingly, supply chain management workloads increased. And in the discussions with those individuals, and it was largely defence industry sharing some of this feedback about just how much additional workforce was required to bring to bear to, for want of a better term, manhandle the supply chain to get the outcomes they needed during that period of disruption. There's another, I think, a very good example of a supply chain disruption. It comes out of the US and it refers to the F-35 production line. I don't know if anybody read the article in the Aviation Weekly, but it highlighted where the F-35 production line had to stop for many weeks. And the reason it was halted was one of the major assemblies. It was one of the motors, electric motors within the F-35. It was identified it had some rare earth metals as part of the magnetised part of that component. And the rare earth metals had been sourced outside the US. And US government policy was those particular rare earth metals could only be sourced from the US. So that vendor had to head off and find alternate, in that case local, domestic US supply for those rare earth metals, magnetise those metals and then recontinue manufacturing that electric motor. But the production line stopped. And so what do we learn from that? Well, firstly, had we had a line of sight to the layers of the supply chain and where that material is being sourced from, it perhaps wouldn't have prepared itself or presented itself, and then to how quickly we might have been able to adapt in response to once we recognised that challenge. Okay, so a quick recap. So we've explored a little bit about supply chain resilience, and we've talked about what it means in the defence context. Let's look at some leading thinking for how to better manage the risk associated with supply chain disruption. Okay, remembering that our description of supply chain resilience is the ability to absorb and recover from disruption. And we see 5 features of resilient supply chains as being key. They are connected, they are visible, they are integrated, they are intelligent, and they are agile. So what do we mean by connected? So by connected, we mean that not only in our own organisations, all the various systems can see each other and bring the visibility together, but we mean across organisations are digitally connected, so beyond our own enterprise architectures. What do we mean by visible? Visibility of material, stock on hand, stock movements, stock availability in real time across the end-to-end supply chain. What do we mean by integrated? Information being shared across our end-to-end supply chains. What do we mean by intelligent? Capable of facilitating optimal decision making to help mitigate potential future supply chain disruptions. And agile is the other side of that. It's actually, once the disruption starts to appear, how do we make the best decisions in light of a clear and emerging disruption? Okay, so we're going to come back later and talk a little bit about some practical steps for defence and defence industry. We're going to talk a little bit about digital twins, but before we do, I'm going to hand back to Lisa, and she's going to share with us the results of that exciting global research that she was alluding to earlier. Over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Steve. Really great context to the global paper. As I mentioned earlier, our global report brings together the findings of 21 in-depth interviews with senior executives from various roles in defence and in defence industry. Thanks, Steve. The report explores how to reset perceptions, overcome barriers, and embed digital twins into new ways of working to reinvent supply chain for decision advantage. Centred around a strong digital core, a total reinvention of the supply chain can illuminate, accelerate, optimise military outcomes, delivering a powerful trifecta: military readiness, organisational resilience, and operational effectiveness. We see digital twins as a key enabler for decision support. But before we go too far, let's take a look at how we frame a digital twin. You know, there's lots and lots of definitions around at the moment as to what it constitutes and what it does not. Our report frames a digital twin as a virtual model of a physical object, process, or system, informed by real-time data that can be used to predict how these elements will respond to different variables. So in supply chain, at one end of the spectrum, this could be a virtual model of a warehouse. The digital twin could use what-if analysis to explore capacity limits, looking at volumetrics under different conditions, so that organisations can make informed choices around the infrastructure that they need and around the resources they might need. At the more sophisticated end of the scale, a digital twin might provide a complete end-to-end virtual replication of the enterprise resource planning tools, enabling organisations to simulate events and understand consequences again in advance of them happening. Things such as, and Steve alluded to a few of them, extended lead times, increases in unit costs, the impact of adjusting stock posture to meet a new customer requirement or to meet a new service level So all things that are really day-to-day core logistics, you can preempt different courses of action before actually doing them, spending budget and potentially wasting resources. So with an enhanced view such as a digital twin provides, imagine the possibilities. We see data-driven insights to help accelerate force readiness and preparedness by anticipating supply chain vulnerabilities in advance of them occurring and impacting the mission. Situational awareness through the use of data to inform strategic and tactical logistics decision-making. Fleet management through better understanding of the costs, risks, benefits, trade-offs associated with different supply chain approaches. Cost efficiency through improved visibility of supply chain purchase orders and supplier profiling in order to potentially illuminate cost reduction activities and opportunities. And very, very important, sustainability through leveraging digital insights to better understand, measure and drive towards more sustainable supply chains. So with the possibilities defined, now let's take a look at some of the barriers illuminated by our interviewees. There's 4 major hurdles identified in this report. The first is the knowledge deficit. STEM shortages and the war on talent make it difficult to build, maintain and sustain these types of skill sets. The data dilemma. Whilst there's no doubt that real-time data is the engine for digital twins, our interviewees flagged concern around the quality, volume and complexity needed to drive these engines and potentially the costs involved in doing so. The security paradox. Our interviewees flagged concern that making data more accessible and available may compromise security. And finally, the supplier gap. Defence organisations rely on an extended network of large and small companies. And as the momentum for digital twins grow, this may create undue pressure, particularly for smaller suppliers, to be able to compete and comply. So before we look at the action plans that the report puts forward, do these types of challenges resonate with those in the room? Are there others that people are willing to share? No? Lots of nods. Yes, we've got one in the front. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So for those that may not have heard, some CASA regulations getting in the way of changing out spare parts, changing alternate parts. Yeah, great. Thank you. So let's just take a quick look at the action plans developed under the report. For the knowledge deficit, there is a range of multifaceted people strategies that need to be employed to sort out the war on talent and the shortage of the required skills that we need to run and manage supply chains. For the data dilemma, leveraging from approved data aggregation approaches to support digital twins is one method, but we also need to invest in analytics and business intelligence platforms to make the user experience of interpreting and using the insights fit for purpose, efficient and effective. For overcoming the security paradox, the report outlined a recommendation to contemporise defence policies and agreements. So certainly a look at some of the constraints there would be well worthwhile to see if we can gain the advantage that we need to get through these digital twins. To improve, promote, incentivise data sharing across the end-to-end supply chain. And whilst it might sound counterintuitive, one of the findings of the report was that increased data sharing may actually have significant benefits on the mission due to the decision support capabilities it provides as opposed to the security threat that's perceived. And finally, for the supply gap, the report advocated for increased collaboration between large and small companies and government-sponsored programs to help SMEs on their data journey. The report confirmed that there is consensus that digital twins are the next major step forward in technology evolution for supply chains. The leaders who spoke to us understand the promise and the time imperative in today's global context. So Steve, I'll hand back to you to take a closer look at our supply chain resilience tools and a digital twin in action.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. It's great research, and when's it get published soon? Shortly? Weeks? Matthew? Okay. So let's get a bit practical now about what sort of steps could defence and defence industry take? How could they step off to increase the resilience in the military supply chains? Well, quite simply, we suggest the initial focus, is about building resilience in the supply chain through driving visibility. It's getting our visibility across the supply chain. And we think there are 3 steps that make sense, sequenced, to drive that visibility. So we talk about the first step being building the supplier relationship. For those of you who have a bit of a play in this space, sometimes called the N-tier supplier relationship. So it's about building an understanding of not who your suppliers are, not only who your suppliers are, but who supplies them, and who supplies them, and who supplies them. Secondly, from there, you build out the digital representation of the supply chain, aka a digital twin. And then lastly, you would use the powers of that digital twin to conduct supply chain scenario planning, to consider the potential vulnerabilities and simulate the impact if those vulnerabilities were ever realised. Okay, so we actually now have a demonstration of a real live digital twin, which we'll take you through. Any questions before I jump into this? Yep. Do you want to answer that? Yeah.
Look, I think that is a common challenge.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of supply chains are only seen to that level 1, and it does come down to those action plans of trying to encourage an environment and culture of increased data sharing, and that's a number of steps. It is, first and foremost, probably looking at policy and how we can enable that without giving up competitive advantage. But yeah, there's definitely layers to it, but it certainly was flagged in the report.
And this example, so yep. So there's an increasing investment in open source supplier relationship and supply data. So probably less so for military, but more so in the commercial space. So this example we're going to see, a lot of this supply network was built out through open source. Now, not all of it, but a lot of it was. So you can get some acceleration through open source availability of supply, and there are firms who specialise in collecting, collating open source supplier relationship data. But in the example we're going to show, actually one of the things, and neither Lisa or I were directly involved in this project, but one of the things we heard as feedback in this is that the role that Accenture played in building this actually gave comfort to the client who we're working with and the suppliers, that there was some intermediary who could mask some of the sensitivities of data that individual suppliers did. Supplier A didn't want supplier B to see, and supplier B didn't want supplier A to see. So using a third party in the middle as a way to manage that sensitivity in building it out. Okay. So what we're going to spend, it's only a 10-minute demo for those who are, desperate to get out of here, which I'm sure that's none of you. But so we're going to take you through, show you a digital twin. We're going to quickly show you how we configured one particular scenario, and then show you the stress test results for that. Now, what we've got actually is it's pre-recorded, and I don't know whether that was because management didn't trust me to run it independently, but anyway, it runs to a script, and I will talk you through it. So what we're seeing here is basically the supply network, and we're looking at some 60-odd suppliers in North America, in Europe, and we're now focusing in on the supply plant. I'll just pause it there. So the red box at the top is actually the company at hand. So this is an automotive manufacturer. They supply electronic components into the automotive industry, and this is a visualization of the supply network that's feeding into that plant in the north of Poland. Okay, so the first thing you see when you look at this, and this is just the visualization tool, the data and the intelligence is obviously sitting behind this visualization tool. What you can see now is the ability to, now we're going to drill down, we're going to look at a particular country. I think we're going to go to somewhere in China. We're going to pick a location, and we're going to look at what parts do they supply. So we select Ninjiang. They're a tier 4 supplier, and I'll come back to that. And we can see that Ninjiang supplies 3 either raw materials or 3 semi-finished materials as input. And I'm just going to pause it there. Actually, I'll let it go a bit further. But what you'll see shortly is it's a 5-tier network. So material in this network flows through 5 suppliers. So tier 5 down to tier 4, down to tier 3, down to tier 2, to tier 1. And tier 1 is typically the first line of visibility. That's who you know you're supplied by. And your production facility then is dealing with the inputs from tier 1. But it's come from tier 2, from tier 3, tier 4, tier 5. So this is a map of all of those suppliers and the relationships. So the first thing you start to see is, oh my gosh, this is quite complex. How would I possibly see all the vulnerabilities in this? So here we're selecting, now we're going to drill down to a particular finished good. So material 1008. Okay, so where does material 1008 come from? So the visualization now is showing where they all come from, and here's the supply inputs. Here's the N-tier map of those, of just material 1008. And all the inputs at level 5 at the top, level 4, down to level 3, level 2, that's all the raw materials, semi-finished goods that go together to build out. Okay, so now once you've got the digital twin, you can leverage the data in lots of different ways. So this particular client wanted to know, I'll just pause it there, this particular client wanted to know, okay, so how does my revenue get affected if certain material's not available? So this is a chart we're going to go through where it visualises, well, okay, how much revenue would we lose if that particular location was disrupted? And each of these bubbles is showing, and the size of the bubble and the visualisation is showing just how much, sorry if I could start it, is showing the value. And you can see the different colours are the different tiers in the network. And I don't know what I've done, Lise. Well, I'll try again. Hope I haven't broken it. There we go. So in the top right, so in the bottom, sorry, you can see the locations. And I think we're going to drill down now on, I think we're going to pick Malaysia, and we're going to look at the contribution of the suppliers in Malaysia. So I think we type NY here, we select Malaysia, and we're going to look at all the suppliers who are supplying raw materials or semi-finished goods into our plant. And then we're going to illuminate a particular supplier in Malaysia. We'll pick one of the largest. So the larger the bubble, the larger the revenue contribution we would lose. Location 16. So location 16 we can see here. I think they're a provider of semiconductor components. There we go, I'll just pause it there. So what we can see here is that the digital twin has highlighted that there's a monthly revenue risk of $32 million if this site went down. That means that the material they provided would limit me as a producer and on-seller. I would lose $32 million a month in sales by not being able to have access to that material because I couldn't complete my build and I couldn't on-sell my products. The top right is showing you which customers get affected because you're selling to multiple customers, and the bottom right shows you which programs are affected. And it's just now taking you through some of the granularity underpinning the digital twin. Okay. So we're now going to jump out of this and we're going to actually configure a scenario. We're going to run a disruption. So we're going to anticipate what a potential disruption could look like, and we're going to load it into the digital twin and ask it to give us some insight. So scenario configuration. I'll pause it here because it goes through this a little quick. Okay. So here the scenario builder asks us, what site would you like to disrupt? And we're going to disrupt site TB9G. Sounds like someone from Joint Logistics Command gave it that label. We've got time to recover in weeks, and we've got, what's the magnitude of the disruption? So obviously 100% means it takes it out of play. We're going to load 13%, which means it's a diluted disruption, but not a complete take it out of play. Okay, we'll let this run. Now, what you'll see when we come back with the results is, in addition to this one scenario, this client has nearly 700 scenarios already loaded. So the results you're going to see aren't now just for that one scenario, unfortunately. It's a very complex, and this is client data, but this is a data set we're seeing the output of where the client has run some 700 scenarios, and the one we've just run is just one of those. But what the client was trying to do was trying to understand at the high level, you know, and down here, you can see if you can see my cursor there. Does it come up? So down here are each of the scenarios, what country, and the visualization at the top is saying basically, for those 700 scenarios, 624 of them have only a moderate impact. Between 90% to 100% of our revenue is maintained. But 47 of them, we actually are going to lose 80. We're only going to keep 80 to 90% of our revenue. And 22%, we're only going to keep 70 to 80% of our revenue. And there's one down the bottom lower left that says we're actually going to lose and only keep 10% of our revenue. We're going to lose 90% of our revenue if that materialised. Okay. Right, so that's the high-level view. More interesting, I think, is the underlying data when we start to talk about what suppliers and what risk each of our suppliers is carrying. So each of these, it's scrolling through. This is probably more interesting anyway. So this is trying to highlight where are our weakest nodes, where's our greatest risk, okay? So this is saying that the scenario here at the top, if that scenario plays out, we're going to lose $400 million. And over on the right are the customers, and over on the lower right is the programs that will be impacted. So if you think about this as the ability to, if that set of results shares with you some concern as management, then you are able to take proactive action and planning to understand, is that risk I want to invest in, or is that risk I'm going to accept, or is it risk I'm going to partially dilute by funding it? But the ability to anticipate a scenario, run a model, get a sense of what the outcome would be, and then decision makers sit around the decision support tool and decide what they might do with a clearer understanding of that risk is the power of these tools. And finally, this is about to wind up, so, and this is just a chart basically saying that lost revenue on the vertical axis, on the right-hand axis is what a thing we call time to survive, TTS, and this is basically helping us see the same data from a different view, but it's basically saying this location here, if the scenario we program for that location materialises, we're going to survive not even 1 week. Okay? All right. And I'm sorry for the complexity in that. It's probably opportunities to clean that up and make that clearer. But I guess if you take nothing from it, this is real. It's a real example, and it's being used in life. And one of the use cases they gave us for us is there was apparently a situation where some serious flooding in Germany, and it disrupted supplies, and they used this tool in the afternoon to figure out what they were going to do about it. So it was less about using the tool to anticipate that disruption, but they used the tool to, okay, the disruption has appeared, has materialised, the risk is realised. Now, how do we plan in response to a known risk? Okay. I think Lisa probably brings us to the end of our show. So before we do our wrap, any questions? Any comments? Anyone got? Yep. I wasn't directly involved. I can certainly go and ask that question, and I think the way that question is probably understood is to what extent there was real-time data being fed at those lower tiers. I'm sorry, yeah. So to what extent those the model, and again I'm not sure exactly, but if it had real-time data feeds, then absolutely the model would be detecting and replaying back the decision support in response to knowing that those downstream nodes were actually being now impacted. To the extent that those downstream node data is static, then you're probably left to make more manual interventions on the decision support. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'll stand up so you can hear me. So you asked before, what do we see as the blockers? One of the things that I've seen come through, I've been working with digital twins for quite some time, is the return on investment for the various layers. So people see these complex models, they go, oh, geez, that's like all this work. What am I going to get out of it? Right? So what is defence going to get out of it? What are the suppliers going to get out of it? And we talked about imposing extra effort onto the supply market. The message to them needs to be, what are you going to get out of it? Right?
Yeah.
So you talked about these open source catalogs.
Yeah.
I'd like to know, what are you seeing with those open source catalogs? Are you seeing that these suppliers are getting on the bandwagon, and they're actually supplying not only their product with a 3D design, but the tiers of their supply chain? How are you seeing that evolve?
Do you want to correct that first, and I'll...
I think in terms of the benefit to defence, what we're saying is it's going to help them to support their mission ultimately, because they can redirect their resources in the right ways. They can preempt certain courses of action, and I guess then they've got all of the information to risk manage, because that's what defence is about, it's risk management. So you can't do that without visibility, without transparency, and that's what digital twins get you. I think that I mentioned before the analytics and business intelligence layer, that needs to be finely tuned to make sure that the right levels are receiving the information that they need. A lot of the information we shared today was relatively tactical, so there's a strategic layer that they really need to be looking at to look at costs and risks and benefits and different courses of action. So decision support is the primary thing that these tools bring to defence, but ultimately that's going to generate increased capability.
But Lisa, I think is the challenge then, how do we encourage suppliers to, what's the incentive for the suppliers to, so what's the incentive, isn't it? And I think if that's where you were heading with your question, it's early days, it's not clear to us that we're doing enough to incent, suppliers, second, third tier suppliers for what's in it for me, which is kind of your ask. I think the opportunity for defence would be, if it goes down this path, is to start using the contracting templates to encourage that in their in the way they contract to the market, and then sort of drive a little bit of requirement through it, which unfortunately would drive cost, which is probably counterintuitive to what we're all trying to do to our supply chains today. But I think there's more to be done. I think policy is important. You heard some of the research is saying there's some barriers to sharing information. And in this example, you know, supplier A was concerned that supplier B was going to see their information. So there are hurdles not yet cleared, but I think as an industry, if we all believe in supply chain digital twins, they're just hurdles we're going to get over, not hurdles we're going to stop at. Sorry.
So I'm with the Tape New South Wales, and through the Institute of Applied Technology, this is going back to the knowledge deficit that was in the earlier slide. What we have is we have a short course running called the Breach and Crisis Management Simulation course.
Yeah.
It's a 7-week long course, and what we're doing is we do like an hour of theory, and then we do an hour and a half where we go through a scenario and we identify, use the systems to work through the problem, analyse it, and also communicate what we find as the situation progresses. One example we use was the ATM shutdown cyber attack from a number of years ago.
Yep.
So a lot of parallels with using that tool in that sense. And so do we see using short courses like that to quickly upskill people using those tools as being beneficial, or do we want to integrate into mainline courses or a bit of both or a shorter solution?
I think it's definitely multifaceted. I think courses like that absolutely contribute, and we should be looking at more of those. You know, I know Defence is doing similar internally. There's data strategies and whatnot to help upskill in terms of data literacy. So I think it is definitely a combination of strategies. Yep.
Yeah. I think the way we've approached many of these projects is to sit with a client and agree a minimal viable product. So we kind of set up where's an MVP, where's a destination that there's enough value in that destination that we haven't sunk an excessive amount of cost where there's no visible return, but we've sunk enough cost to generate enough benefit to build the business case to then take it further. So there's another client we're working with where the MVP was a subsystem. So we took a major system as part of the platform and we built out the digital twin for just that system. And I guess at that point, the value proposition either proves itself and the barriers that you've had to jump through that MVP process has either demonstrated there's value or there's opportunity, or the hurdles are too high, cost prohibitive or whatever for you to jump over. But that's often a way, and the larger the network, the more likely you're going to use an MVP probably, because to eat that elephant is a non-trivial activity. If we come back to just defence though, you know, I think that the discussion should start with what sort of force multiplier does decision support in using a digital twin for in theatre is actually, I think, the value proposition in a defence context. Now, this is a commercial concept, so slightly different, but I think we need to have stronger arguments around using supply chain resilience tool sets to help better decision support, not only anticipate, but what to do in the oh hell moment. That's cut, right, they're not options to move material. How do we move it a different way, and what's the capacity? I'd probably say it almost blends less with the digital twin, but probably more with digital manufacturing, digital design, digital architectures, and sharing of the configuration management data, the configuration baseline data, and yes, then a digital twin would leverage that data set for having a shared understanding of the configuration of the asset through all the individual players who are contributing to that asset, and I would think the supply chain would piggyback off that. Lisa, do you have a different view?
Just one other comment though about the cost and complexity of digital twins. I think that there's a number of resilience tools, and so there's a spectrum also within a digital twin, and I gave a couple of examples, but it depends on the business problem as well. So you might need a cost optimizer tool because you've got a cost problem. So that's a whole other tool that you can explore to look at cost visibility and opportunities. NTIM mapping, you may wish to choose with that to look at your supplier baseline because you are worried about where your raw materials are being sourced from, and you can get value out of those products and build up to a digital twin as well. So there's certainly ways and strategies of managing that cost and complexity depending on your business and your business problem. It's a tricky one, Jackie. I think I can see benefit to something like this for JLC, for planning, for looking at volumetrics. The force is always changing. DSR's about to drop. There's going to be always movements with the force depending upon geopolitical circumstances. Why don't we model and see what that would do to your distribution network so you've got that visibility? So I think that's a use case. I think we need to sort of talk to Defence about the possibilities, the opportunities, and then look at some of the constraints we have with the ICT network and other things as well to be able to work through those together. So it's definitely, a collaborative activity, but I think that there's lots of opportunity both within Defence, but particularly for Defence industry to support Defence.
And I think with Defence moving cloud, it's moving into cloud, secure cloud, potentially even higher levels of cloud moving forward. I think that the opportunities are going to be greater to get to that connected. As the digital core gets connected, then all of a sudden we can start to build on a more connected, whereas, the current architectures of largely on-prem, we're a bit more constrained for how we... Remember I said the 5 features of an intelligent, of a resilient supply chain? Connectedness is key, and, that digital core, not just within your own IT architecture, but within the enterprise, end-to-end, is actually a great base to start from. Are we at time? How did we go? Well, if there's no more questions, I guess we'd like to thank everyone for attending. Thank you. Great audience participation. And I guess enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.